All right, so welcome to the estrogen biotransformation and your genetics and breast cancer risk. So, my name is Dr. Betty Murray. I'm a PhD. My area's research was actually looking at hormone metabolism and its role in women's health. And particularly, I also looked at IBS. And so, what we're going to be covering today is some of the key genetics and what the current research shows as potential risk factors for breast cancer risk and some of the nuances to that research when we're looking at it, and then where the opportunities for additional research are, and then specifically some of the things that you can think about as you go forward to understand your own genetics. And I think before I even get started on that, what I want to make sure that everybody that's watching this understands is that your genes, regardless if they are good or air quote bad, your genes are not determinate. Your genes are general inclination or a potential. And really, the power of learning what your genetics are and then going a little bit further and looking at how they also express themselves, called your epigenetics, is one of the most powerful things that you have agency over. And so, even when we're talking about something as classically concerning as breast cancer is primarily driven by lifestyle factors. And so that means that you have the ability to make a lot of determining changes and activities that you have control of that can change that. All right. So, again, we're looking at that estrogen breast cancer SNP risk. So let's talk a little bit about that. So obviously, genetics, and when we're looking at the genetics that are done by the DNA Co., they are SNPs, or otherwise known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are kind of like small spelling errors. Like let's say you're writing a word and it should be an A instead of an E. When you go to read it, you absolutely can tell what that word means, even though it's mildly misspelled. And so SNPs are kind of like that. They're small changes to the sequence of amino acids in your DNA that slightly alter an enzyme pathway. That enzyme may make a protein, it may move some particular biochemical pathway, and it doesn't impair it completely, but it slightly alters it. And it's really part of your parents' background, your ancestors and your ancestors' ancestors. Most of these things came about based on environmental factors that required our ancestors' DNA to change to survive those environments. So genetics aren't determinate, they are potential. And in many cases, a lot of the things that we would consider bad genetics today are they themselves not necessarily bad. It's more so that we have changed our environment, and the environment now has more pressures on those genes than before. And I would say never ever is there a better case for this than the estrogen metabolism pathway. And that's what we're going to dig into today. So think of your estrogen pathways as a traffic system. Our body is like this bustling city with traffic flowing through it. We've got highways, we've got streets, we've got alleys, we've got parking lots, we even have bike trails. And we have, just like we have different highways and exits and traffic patterns, and that determine kind of where our cars end up, whether we get to our location on time or not. Our estrogen patterns are very similar. We have different metabolic highways or streets or alleys that determine where our estrogen and hormones go. And we basically break that down into, really, I would like to say, three phases, but the first two are the ones that we have the most understanding of. So the first phase is phase one. That's your main highway. And your main highway is managed by your cytochrome P450 enzymes. Specifically, when we're looking at your DNA, we're looking at your CYP1A1 gene, your CYP1B1, and CYP3A4, which primarily convert your estrogen byproducts that were slated in to go to the liver to get packaged to go out to the trash. It changes these hormones into a water-soluble form, right? Prior to that, those hormones and those other xenoestrogens are fat-soluble. So the phase one main highway is very important. And even more importantly, the production of these metabolites, these byproducts of these genes, are actually generally more toxic than the original ingredient, whatever that was, whether it's your hormones or your plasticizer, herbicides, pesticides, phthalates, fragrances, the things that outgas from your electronic devices. The reality is these cytochrome P450 enzymes metabolizing natural hormones, right? Taking estrogen and moving it through that process is not really challenging. Where our environment has radically changed is the 50,000 plus chemicals that we've added to our foods and our environment since basically the Industrial Revolution that has now put a big challenge, a big challenge on these pathways, because we now have more things going through this highway system. And in many cases, when we have a slow, let's say CYP1B1, which is a less favorable pathway, it's kind of like your highway all of a sudden having an accident and everything backs up on it, right? So that cytochrome P450 pathway is that very first large highway system. Now, once that system is done, we have phase two. And so phase two is managed by other genes and enzymes like COMT, GST, the UGT enzymes, and other enzymes like SOLT and genes called SOLT1A1. These are the secondary processes that take the byproduct of the highway. So think of it, you're on the highway. When you go to phase two, you get off on the feeder road. So these genes, COMT, GST, SOD, are the feeder roads that then help you get those estrogen metabolites to the trash can. And these help make them water soluble and move them through elimination, right? Now, if we look at the CYP1B1 pathways, we're going to have three critical pathways, right? There's the CYP1A1 pathway. That's the 2-hydroxy or 2-hydroxylation pathway. Think of this as your safer neighborhood, right? This is the pathway that has a protective mechanism against estrogen-sensitive cancers like breast cancer. And so if I have a genetic pattern that increases my ability to move my xenoestrogens and my natural estrogens into this 2-hydroxy pathway, I am going to have a reduced risk for breast cancer because it's a cleaner pathway. Now, we have the CYP1B1 pathway that produces 4-hydroxyestrone and estradiol. This is considered a riskier district. So this is a riskier neighborhood. And it can form when we have too much going through this pathway. If we are mutated where we make more of the 4-hydroxy pathway, we make byproducts that are called damaging quinones, and they can damage your DNA, right? So what that means is they cause secondary damage to your DNA, which causes more spelling errors, which have an increased risk for potential changes that could lead to tumor increased risk. The 4-hydroxy pathway is a pathway that we watch because the literature shows that that has a implication for increased risk for estrogen sensitive cancers like breast cancer. Now, we also have a 16-alpha hydroxy pathway, which is controlled by CYP3A4. And from that 16-alpha hydroxy pathway, it also makes estriol, which is a weaker estrogen, but it's a necessary estrogen that our body uses. It's often fairly low when we're not pregnant. When we're pregnant, we actually see a significant rise in that hormone, but it has its own effect by attaching itself to the estrogen B receptor, which actually shows cancer protection. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So estriol that comes off of the 16-alpha hydroxy pathway is actually protective. And we make more of that than we do estradiol or estrone, which are the two other estrogens our body makes. So when we look at 16-alpha hydroxy, that one, if it's overproduced and we aren't making as much estriol, and we have an amplification of that pathway, what we find is that it makes more selective processes for DNA problems, and it has a proliferating effect. So if there's cells that are growing, it proliferates those cells. So it has also a slightly increased risk for breast cancer. So your take-home message from this slide is if we were looking at it as a pie chart, I want the majority of my pie chart to go to the 2-hydroxy pathway. I want a little small sliver to go to 4-hydroxy. There's never a time that you will see it be 100% 2-hydroxy. And I also want a little sliver to go the 16-alpha hydroxy. But I want the dominance to be that 2-hydroxy pathway that's controlled by the CYP1A1 gene. So if you're listening to me and you're going, oh, I'm going to pull out my DNA company test and I want to understand what I'm looking at, is if I have mutations that slow that 2-hydroxy pathway or increase the 4-hydroxy or the 16 alpha, my attention should be focused on ways to shift those two less favorable pathways to push them towards 2-hydroxy. And here's where it becomes very cool. What you eat, how you live your life, and the exercise you do and the supplements you take can help control those pathways. And so those things can help move it even if you don't have the best of genetics. So like I said, that CYP1A1, the less harmful, the polymorphism that is protective against breast cancer, right? So what this means is if you have a protective breast cancer gene in CYP1A1, so you have a faster moving enzyme to make more of your 2-hydroxyestrone, you have a protective activity against breast cancer. So this is a positive, right? If we look at CYP1B1, right, this is creates that 4-hydroxyestrone. When we look at the polymorphism and then we start looking at the literature, so now I'm going to start getting into the geeky side, my PhD side of what does the literature really show. So the research shows that the individual SNPs on the 4-hydroxy pathway have a subtle effect, right? When we understand that the mutation of the leucine valine part of that gene has a subtle effect. So the other thing I want you to understand is, let's say you're like me and you've got a mutation on CYP1B1, making it more rapidly producing the 4-hydroxy. When we look across large populations, there is a subtle effect of that gene. However, when we look at somebody who has breast cancer, right? So we're moving now from the idea of prevention to active breast cancer. Those are kind of two different things. So preventatively, if you have a mutation here, it's manipulatable. In the literature, it doesn't show a significant risk. Now, if somebody currently has estrogen sensitive breast cancer, the breast cancer cells, the tumor cells, are what, and your breast cells themselves express this gene. So when the CYP1B1 gene is highly expressed in a tumor cell, that has been shown to produce cancer cell growth, right? So that's an important distinction. There is a subtle effect of risk of just having the gene, and then having the gene expressed in a tumor is going to be much greater if somebody has active breast cancer. Now, when we get to the CYP3A4, this is again that less protective effect, right? This creates the proliferation or the potential for the cells to rapidly produce new daughter cells. And when we look at the most studied polymorphism and the mutation, this variant shows decreased metabolism of estrogen and decreased ability to metabolize, particularly some of the chemotherapy drugs. Now, I know that we're often more holistic on the DNAco side, and especially myself with my company Minerva and my clinic. But if somebody is going down the treatment side, the expression of a 3A4 enzyme pathway will affect how your body metabolizes estrogen and the chemotherapy drugs. This gene is also very much affected by other medications, things like antidepressants, painkillers, statin medications. And so if somebody's also on polypharmacy, where they're on maybe many, many different medications that might affect this pathway, that will change the impact of this gene. And I think this is where knowing your genetics is awesome, and then being able to test your genetics in action, like doing a urinary hormone Dutch test, or there's several companies out there that provide this test, which shows that genetic pathway in action, can really help, because you can see, hey, if I happen to be taking a couple other medications that also impact this pathway, I'll be able to see to what degree that may be affecting my estrogen metabolism, right? So genetics are one side, and then looking at like a urinary Dutch test, or it's also called a hormone zoomer with Vibrant Clinical Labs, or Meridian Valley urinary hormones. There's lots of companies that make these. But know that if you have mutations in this gene and you're on other medications that go through here, you're going to have a slight change in that risk ratio. Now, here's where it's interesting when we look at large populations, right? So when we look at risk and we look at it in research, there is kind of absolute risk, which is a personalized risk, and then there's relative risk. When we're looking at large populations, a lot of times what we're looking at is what we call relative risk, right? So when we look at relative risks in the population for breast cancer, this CYP3A4 doesn't have necessarily a much greater risk when we look at large swaths of women, right? So the risk of mutations on CYP3A4 when we look at hundreds of thousands of women isn't great, right? The relative risk is also not great. Now, when we look at absolute risk for breast cancer, a compounding effect. So let's say you have mutations that increase your CYP3A4 production of a less favorable 16 alpha hydroxyestrone, and you're on polypharmacy. So let's say you're taking other medications that go through here, you may be at a slightly increased absolute risk, but it does impact cancer treatment more clearly than it does general risk for breast cancer over your lifetime. I know that can be super confusing, but it's important to know that the absolute risk is more so around treatment. The relative risk is not really strong when we look at large groups of women. Now let's get to phase 2, right? So phase 2, I like to think of our ability to metabolize estrogen as kind of a series of wrappers, right? So phase 1, I'm wrapping it either in a green wrapper, which is the 2-hydroxy, most protective, or I'm wrapping it in a blue wrapper, CYP3A4 driven, the 16-hydroxy, not as good. And then the 4-hydroxyestrone is the red wrapper, right? Don't want to make a lot of that. Now, that doesn't help you get it to the trash. You can't take those estrogen byproducts of hydroxylation and get them out of the body. They have to be passed to the feeder road, right? They're going to be passed to these genes like COMT, COMT. And this is your master methylator. And basically, this neutralizes estrogens. It also neutralizes your catecholamines like dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. And it's like having different sort of engines in your metabolic pathways. So if we look at your VAL, the GG version, it's highly active. This is a sports car of estrogen metabolism. It processes hormones really quickly. So if you're a fast COMT, you're going to wrap up. So imagine COMT as a pink wrapper. You're going to wrap up either the 4-hydroxyestrone or the 2-hydroxyestrone in a pink wrapper really quickly, right? That's the most positive because that means stuff doesn't get stuck on the highway and it helps move it to the next stage. Now, when somebody has a MET, right, they have low activity. This is more like a compact car, Nissan Leaf. It's not going to hit 0 to 100 on the highway, right? It might get there, but it's going to take you a while. It is much slower, right? So that means that your ability to wrap that wrapper around it, the pink one, is somewhat impaired. You're slow for estrogen clearance, right? That's been associated with more estrogen dominant sort of states, higher risk for endometriosis, fibroids, heavy periods. If you're a curvy girl, if you happen to be a female watching this, greater curviness usually means that there might be something here. What's interesting about this is this also makes it slow to clear dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. This is where the worrier warrior comes in. Those individuals that carry a slow COMT often can multitask, matter of fact, they call it the executive gene. And because more executives carry this mutation than not. However, it can be less favorable when we're talking about estrogen and the massive amount of xenobiotics and other toxins that go through this pathway. So if you happen to be a low activity version, you're a little slower, right? We want to support methylation with methyl ingredients, your methylfolate, your hydroxy B12, your methylcobalamin, potentially folinic acid, B6, B2, all of those can help. Now, if you're a middle ground of Valmet, that means you're kind of the reliable Camry of the bunch. You're, gas engine, but pretty efficient, and you're kind of in the middle of ground. Right, so COMT is really, really important, but COMT isn't the only gene. And if we looked at the COMT conundrum, this is where we start to see the clearance of all these other things, your neurotransmitters. And, so like I said, if you have a slow COMT, can be like higher baseline dopamine. You're going to have a slower clearance of dopamine, which usually results in better focus under low stress conditions. If you've got a slower COMT, you'll have greater sensitivity to stress because you can't clear hormones effectively. So on one side, it may be valuable. On the other side, it may be less valuable based on our current sort of stressful lifestyle. It's also implicated in pain processing, right? How you process pain. It can increase it or decrease it. And some of your medications are also affected on how much medication response somebody has. So COMT can also be impacted. So if you're on medications like SNRIs or other medications that might amplify your adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine with a slow COMT, you may be more affected. And many, many times those medications don't work the same in those individuals. And again, if we look at the COMT patterns, right? So if we look at a bunch of different studies, meta-analysis pulled together a bunch of different studies to sort of give an understanding. So this particular one looked at 56 different studies, 34,000 breast cancer cases, and then 45,000 controls, meaning they did not have breast cancer. Now, here's where it's important, is they didn't find any association with COMT mutations and breast cancer risk. But when they looked at, then when they took it down and did some randomization and started looking at individual populations, again, we got to remember that these genes mutated based on our ancestors' experience of our environments. So the other thing that's important about genetics is your ancestry matters, right? Certain populations with combinations of genes have different impact. So for an example, European populations, women with the MET-MET genotype, the slow metabolizers, showed a borderline significant decreased risk of breast cancer, right? This surprised a bunch of researchers, right? It was different. But when they looked at Asian populations, another study, a meta-analysis of 26 different studies, found that the same genotype was associated with increased breast cancer risk, particularly in postmenopausal women, which I want to take a moment here to think about that. Our risk for breast cancer goes up dramatically in postmenopause when your body is not making estrogen anymore, right? Ovaries are out of eggs. There's no more estrogen being produced. The average age of diagnosis of breast cancer in the United States is 62 years old. And so everybody has an increased risk of breast cancer as we get older. And a lot of that is because we create more spelling errors as we get older, as our cells replicate. But this is where we see a difference in ethnic background and ancestry that really individualize the need to have different recommendations according to your own genetics and ancestry pathways. And so it's never, ever really cut and dry across all populations to say that one risk is the same across everybody. We also have your glutathione pathway that can affect how you detoxify. So if you have GST enzymes, GSTP enzymes, GSTM1, where you are slow or unable to make appropriate glutathione, that starts to slow this pathway too. But what I want to talk about now is as we move from phase 2, right, which is predominantly your COMT, your GST, your SOD, and then your UGT enzymes, right, your genes, right, and then SOLT1A1 being the other ones. So think of those are the dumpster that you're dropping off your estrogen byproducts in that are now going to go out through the trash. So phase 3, we'll call it, is your body's ability to move these estrogen byproducts into the stool, which is the dominant pathway for estradiol, which is what your ovaries make, or the urine, which is the predominant pathway for estrone to go out, which is what's made predominantly by the body fat. Right? So when we're postmenopausal, we make a lot more estrone than we do estradiol. Estradiol is protective, estrone can be pro-inflammatory, but they have two major exit routes. So this is where actually a bunch of my research comes in, because your gut microbiome will make a difference as to whether it gets out in the stool or not. And this is really, really important. When our body prepares those toxins, it's put into the bile that's in your liver. So think of the bile helps us emulsify fats, but it is also your sludge and trash from the liver detoxification pathway. And that bile goes out into the gallbladder, if you still have it, goes into the intestines, and it gets bound to things like fiber, and some of the bile acids later on get absorbed into the colon. But ideally, all those toxins that are in the bile go out through the stool. Your microbiome, there is a group of bacteria called the estrobolome. The estrobolome make an enzyme called beta glucuronidase that can take that estrogen-like compounds, the toxins that are in your dumpster, basically open up the dumpster, flip it open, grab the estrogens that are in there that have been wrapped up to go out, and throw them back into circulation. Right? There's a couple reasons why our body does this in combination with these microbes. When we're young, those microbial combinations that make beta glucuronidase generally in a healthy gut are relatively low. But as we go through menopause, the bacteria that make beta glucuronidase, that unwrap estrogen like compounds and allow it to get recirculated into the bloodstream, increase. This is a secondary way our body has to get more estrogen circulating. Not the most ideal, but absolutely true. So, your microbiome specifically do a process called deconjugation when they make too much beta glucuronidase, which deconjugation says, hey, take that estrogen compound out of its wrapper and put it back into the bloodstream. And it can be very problematic if there's too much of it. The research shows that beta glucuronidase, when it is high in the stool made by bacteria, it increases the risk for breast cancer potentially, poor outcomes for breast cancer treatment, many of the drugs that will impair or affect the drug effectiveness, and also increase risk for things like colon cancer if it's extremely high. Now, the goal isn't for it to be extremely low either. When you got the right bacterial balance, you get less reabsorption of those estrogens slated for the trash. So the bacteria make a difference, right? If it's out of balance, then you're going to have more potentially estrogen compounds getting reabsorbed. Now, if you're menopausal and not making a lot of estrogen, what else could be deconjugated by your bacteria, or unwrapped, and put into the bloodstream? Your plasticizers, herbicides, pesticides, toxins, phthalates that were slated to go out of the trash can get recirculated into your bloodstream to then attach itself to your receptors. And if we turn on receptors in breast tissue and other places, we have a greater risk of those xenoestrogens potentially stimulating cancer growth or tumor growth, right? So the healthiest thing to happen here when we look at the microbiome's impact on your dumpster activity for estrogens slated to go to the trash is to have a really healthy gut microbiome, for them to be fed with things like high fiber foods, prebiotics. Those things keep the balance of the microbiome with reduced levels of beta glucuronidase producing bacteria. If you have a really bad diet, or a very low fiber, low carbohydrate diet, you will grow more of those bacteria, and especially as we get older. So the microbiome make a difference on whether your body can actually get rid of estrogen-like compounds, and it can either increase or decrease that risk for breast cancer. Again, it's not huge absolute risk, but it does make a difference. Now, an area of intense research is how estrone gets out of the body, right? So we've made it through the CYP enzymes. We've made it through your phase 2 enzymes like COMT, GST, and SOD. Now we're also looking at sulfation, right? Sulfation plays a critical role in how your body gets the other side of estrogen, estrone, which is made mostly by our fat cells, and it can interconvert into estradiol. And that is how your body excretes estrogen compounds through the urine, right? And we can have mutations here, meaning that I can either get it out through the urine or it's going to be impaired. And it does that by adding what they call a sulfate group, right? And this is also essential for estrogen balance. And if we have slow enzymes here, we have the ability for the body to not clear estrogen very well. And that means that we have these kind of half broken. If you think of your hormones kind of as a key, imagine you have a key that sort of is bent and you can jam it in the lock, but it doesn't work very well. That's what toxins and estrogen detoxification byproducts that don't make it to the dumpster do in your body to the receptors. They go in like a half broken key and they sort of halfway turn on the enzyme pathway or the activity of the cell, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do because it is a toxin rather than the true hormone, right? So sulfation is also very important, and that drives our urinary excretion of hormones. And that huge reason is we can actually look at these pathways in action when we look at urinary hormone metabolism, like the Dutch test. We can actually see your genetic pathways in real time to see how much 2, 4, or 16 hydroxyestrone, how much methylation is happening at COMT, and then how much are we getting out of the body, right? Which is very, very important. Now, like I said before, populations matter. If we look at the individual studies of genetics, your background, your genes and genetic architecture, your genes don't work alone, right? So they work in pathways, and that's why the DNA code is important, because they were looking at pathways. Your environmental exposures, again, it's more about your environment and your epigenetics than it is about the absolute mutation you may or may not have. Your different baseline hormone patterns and cycling patterns influence outcomes. So if you're cycling, let's say you're 35 and still cycling, that is different than 55 and no longer cycling. And so it's important when you're looking at hormones that we also take into effect the risk patterns that may be associated with younger women, which generally they are protected against breast cancer compared to older women. Again, the diagnosis of breast cancer is much greater over 50 than it is under 50. And probably one of the greatest risk factors for breast cancer that doesn't get talked about is body composition, right? Being overweight increases your risk, depending on the study, somewhere between 14 and 21% for breast cancer, right? Way more than your genetics for estrogen metabolism. So body composition matters. And I would also add to this alcohol consumption. If you are worried about breast cancer, regardless of your genetic SNPs, regardless of your other pieces, helping improve your body composition, so your body fat to muscle ratio, and also reducing or eliminating alcohol will reduce your risks more than anything else. More than anything else. Those are the two largest modifiable risk factors we have, right? Body composition being a biggie. All right. So now that we've walked through all of those genetic SNP patterns and what they do, let's talk about the actionable steps that you have. So when I think about these patterns, right, is we teach them in a very linear fashion from your estrogen to your CYP enzymes to your COMT and GST and SOD, and then to your dumpster. However, the clearing of those go in reverse order, right? So here's another way to think about it. If you're cleaning out your attic and which would be way up here at phase 1, and you're cleaning out all your closets in your house and getting everything into the garage, you can't get it out of the garage until you open the garage door, right? So when we go to clean up these processes, you want to think of going in reverse order. So am I hydrated, right? Am I drinking plenty of water so I can move toxins out of my body? Highly concentrated urine gives you an opportunity to reabsorb things, right? Same thing with stool. You do not want to be constipated. If I left your trash in your house, in your kitchen, in a trash bag at 98 degrees for a week, I promise you it would be nasty. So the reality is you don't want to be constipated either, because that allows the toxins that are slated to go out with the trash that are in your stool to get reabsorbed. So when we look at getting rid of toxins and improving these pathways, whether it's breast cancer risk or anything to make me feel better, I got to be pooping, I got to be peeing, period. Right? Then we look at phase 2, right? We want to make sure that I've got methylation and amino acids, that I've got B vitamins on board, vitamin C. I've got a bunch of amino acids. So the other thing I hear people say all the time is, I'm going to go on a juice cleanse so I can detoxify. Well, you're going to detox and retox. Amino acids are what conjugate, or what makes that wrapper in phase 2 get rid of the dumpster, get everything to the dumpster. So we want to support those nutrients and have sulfur containing foods too, like your onions, your garlic, your brassica family. Even taking an Epsom salt bath is a sulfate donor, right? That helps you do estrogen detox, right? Because that's opening the garage door. Then we want to go and then move to your CYP enzymes, your CYP enzymes. And you want to make sure that you support those. And that's where things like blueberries, raspberries, rosemary, your brassica family, indole 3-carbinol, DIM, broccoli, sulforaphane, all of those ingredients, curcumin, hops, citrus bioflavonoids, all improve those pathways. So I'm pooping, I'm peeing, I've got my amino acids, my B vitamins, my magnesium, my sulfur compounds, and then I've got those secondary nutrients that do phase one. And then I want to reduce my estrogen disrupting things, plastics, herbicides, pesticides, all the crap that we put in cosmetics and body care products. We absorb all that. Anything that goes on your skin goes in your body, right? So we work on minimizing those. You can't get rid of 100% of them, but we can definitely lower the load. And we want to optimize liver function, right? So that means taking care of our liver, making sure that we don't get fatty liver. So we want to make sure our body composition is healthy. We also know that if you, a matter of fact, drink wine, if you're having a glass or two of wine at night, that slows your body's ability to clear alcohol because it's producing acetaldehyde. The other thing it does is it shuts down your glutathione, right? And so if I don't have a lot of glutathione and I'm having a glass of wine every night, right, and our ability to clear this stuff gets worse as we get older, I'm basically shutting down my glutathione pathway every night. And most of your detoxification is amplified at night. So even your glass of wine at night could be really causing some significant slowdown in your ability to get toxins out of the body, right? And like I said, maintaining that healthy body composition is really, really important. All right, so your take home message, right? Your take home message is your genes are there and they helped your ancestors get here, right? They helped us survive the planet. It's just our environment is no longer positive reinforcement for our genetics in many cases. And probably estrogen and estrogen detoxification is one of the most impacted pathways that we have. But you have power over this. You're not a passive victim of your genetics. You're equipped with natural sort of active architects for our health destiny, right? It gives us an ability to actually manipulate these pathways. And you have way more tools and way more possibilities than any generation of women before us, right? And with knowledge comes power to make active decisions that help improve things. Knowledge itself isn't it. It's knowledge and action. And so this opportunity, learning more about how you can take proactive epigenetic modification every day, is the way to reduce your risk for estrogen sensitive cancers or breast cancer, right? Because the genetics itself is not the major determinant. It's our environment and how we handle our environment and what we do to mitigate those risks. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this was helpful in helping you understand estrogen metabolism and how it plays a role, both positive and negative, in breast cancer risk and also breast cancer treatment. And even more importantly, how you can take an active role to improve your overall health and your overall estrogen biotransformation.